It's the off season, but we still have a ton to talk about today, and I'll start by saying that today is going to start a 6-week stretch of rankings as we'll be going through every single position in the NBA, formulating a top 10 list, and eventually capping off that 6-week stretch with a top 10 players list in the NBA today. But before we get into that, we're going to dive into what's happened so far in free agency, hand out some winners and losers, as well as dive into some summer league action. So we have a lot to talk about here on today's show. If you don't want to wait, the timestamps will be in the description down below. But this is your early reminder. We're on the road to 500 subs on the channel, and we're only like 120 away or so. So that's like a dream come true, right? I started this channel out the blue, and now we're on the road to 500 subs. So if you can help us get to that point, I'd really appreciate it. But without further ado, this is the Anomaly Podcast. I'm Owen. Let's get into some news. And we're going to start here with the free agency winners and losers, as we should always start on the winning side, right? Start off on a good note and then make your way down to the losing side. But individually, Dillon Brooks, for getting a 4-year, $80 million contract, is my first winner here in free agency, as this is a guy who was cut by Memphis immediately after the season and was looked at as a scapegoat for why they fell the way they did in the playoffs. And then just, I feel like a week or two ago, right before free agency started, all reports said that he just wanted a little bit more than the mid-level exception, which is about $12.5 million a year. So maybe like $15 million a season for Dillon Brooks. But then a couple days later, Dillon Brooks came out and the Houston Rockets signed him for $80 million, $20 million a season over the next 4 years. Not to say that Dillon Brooks can't eventually live up to that price tag, right? And not to say that he can't be a great veteran or vocal leader for this young Houston Rockets core. But man, is he worth $80 million? That's a question we have to ask ourselves down in the comments. But to me, it doesn't matter. Shout out to Dillon Brooks, right? He got generational money there, and his agent, shout out to him for getting this money for a guy like Dillon Brooks. But I don't know what the Houston Rockets are doing in this situation. I think you could have got a guy like Dillon Brooks for about $20 million cheaper. But moving over to the Dallas Mavericks for re-signing Kyrie Irving and bringing in Seth Curry, right? And we'll talk about this later with a different team, but the domino effect is real in sports, right? And to me, the Mavericks can breathe a little. Let me explain. As like I said, they re-signed Kyrie, a top 10 guard in the NBA, no matter how you split it. And they also brought in Seth Curry, right? A guy who brings exactly what they need on the offensive side of the ball, which is elite spacing and elite three-point shooting. My worry for this team this offseason, coming into the offseason rather, was that if Kyrie went elsewhere, how is Luka going to react, right? How would he view the franchise and the organization going forward? Because last year, he already said multiple times that he was losing his love for the game of basketball, and a lot of that was because of the team construction in Dallas, right? But then if you went on and this Dallas team lost Kyrie this offseason, it was going to leave Luka with no help again, right? So to me, we might have been looking at a Luka possible trade request after next season. I don't think Luka's the type to request a trade and run from the grind, quote unquote, per Damian Lillard. But if they lost Kyrie and they brought in no help this offseason, Luka was going to only get more frustrated. This team was going to underperform as far as team success. And then, like I said, we might have been looking at a Luka trade request going into next year, right? But Dallas, they, shout out to them. They did what they needed to do. They brought in the people they needed to bring back, and they also signed a couple other key pieces. And to me, unless something goes terribly wrong next season, I think they can breathe when it comes to Luka and his future with the organization. Moving over to Damian Lillard and the Portland Trailblazers, as I've talked about this a lot this offseason. But Damian Lillard's trade request is a perfect move for both sides of the coin, right? As Damian Lillard, he can leave for a contender. He doesn't have to run from the grind anymore, and he can still get his money, and he can still finish his career trying to win at a high level, and that is to compete for some championship rings, right? Also, the Blazers, they get to finally reset, move on from this era, and they get to commit to a rebuild, quote unquote, as they're still going to get a ton back from Dame. They still have tons of young talent on this team, so they're going to be in a great spot moving forward. I think it was just a win-win for both sides of it. And, Damian Lillard requesting a trade, we don't know where he's going to go yet, right? It seems like there's 8 teams in the mix right now, but I'm going to guess it's going to be Miami, and you'll see that later on in the rankings. But Damian Lillard, I'm happy to see him finally get out of that situation, and I'm finally that this new regime in Portland is committing to a rebuild, because the previous one was failing to do that, right? They wanted to keep everybody happy. And sometimes you got to make a change if you want to win some games, probably put your franchise in the right direction. Draymond Green and Golden State, another two sides of the coin where it's a perfect fit going forward, as there was rumors that last year was the last dance in Golden State. There's also been rumors that next year will be Steve Kerr's last year no matter what. But thankfully, to me, it wasn't the last dance for Golden State last year, and Draymond's going to be back for at least 3 more years with the Warriors. It also seems like Steve Kerr won't be gone after next season, which is always good, right? As a Cavs fan even, I'm saying it just makes sense that core 4 is there in Golden State. But in Draymond's words, I've been here for 12 years. You can't just throw that away. The core of Curry, Clay, and Dre with Steve Kerr will be able to finish their decorated story there in Golden State that they've written over this last decade, really. And they're going to retire as maybe the best big 3 in the history of the NBA, as crazy as that might sound. But moving over to my last winner, I'm going to have the GM, the Lakers, as they have built a contender. They've maybe had the best offseason out of any team in the NBA, as they re-signed Rui Hachimura, they re-signed Austin Reeves, and they even re-signed D'Lo. So you stop there, and I think, you know, if you're a Lakers fan, you're like, okay, we had a pretty good offseason, we had a successful last year, let's just bring the core back and run it back, right? But this team went over, they went overboard as they brought in Cam Reddish, a guy who I think still has plenty of potential that he needs to untap. Jackson Hayes was also brought in, Taurean Prince, and Gabe Vincent, right? I mean, after Gabe Vincent was signed to a 3-year, $30 million contract, we were like, okay, D'Angelo Russell is gone. He's going to move elsewhere. But no, they brought back D'Angelo Russell. I mean, this team is stacked. I think they're like 10 or 11 deep going into next year, and that's going to be awesome for LeBron and AD, who they need their load management, right? Let's be honest. But I mean, this time, to me, the times when this LeBron and AD Lakers era has been the most dominant is when they don't overcomplicate it, right? They surround LeBron and AD with two-way players that some of them can at times take the pressure off of Anthony Davis and LeBron James, right? A guy like Austin Reeves, a guy like Rui Hachimura. These are not Austin Reeves is not two-way, but he can take the pressure off of LeBron James and Anthony Davis, right? You guys get what I'm saying. But that's exactly what this Lakers team has done this offseason. They've brought in guys that have two-way ability, and they can at times take the pressure off of LeBron and AD, as well as space the floor. Some other winners I want to just throw out there are Washington. I think, shout out to them as they got 12 total picks for aging stars in Kristaps Porzingis and Bradley Beal. And they also brought in 2 building blocks, right? They re-signed Kyle Kuzma, and they brought in Jordan Poole. Whatever your thoughts are on Jordan Poole, he's going to be a good scorer for them next year, right? And he could potentially be a good building block for that team going forward. Utah is another team I want to throw out, strictly just because of the John Collins trade, right? They brought him in for nothing, and his contract is not impossible to move, right? It's kind of like the value. So maybe John Collins can build his value back up, and then Utah can ship him out for a first-round pick. I mean, why not take that shot on the potential that John Collins has? And finally, my last winner is Sacramento, right? Sacramento, they kept their core. They didn't do anything crazy after 1 year of success, and they're going to run it back with the same core. And we're going to talk about it later, but Keegan Murray, I mean, he looked even better than last year in the Summer League. So, I mean, Sacramento, sometimes you just need to bring it back, and sometimes you just need to keep the continuity, and that's exactly what they did, so shout out to them. Free agency losers. We're going to talk about the Houston Rockets on the other side of the coin. They overspent on Dillon Brooks' contract. For the player, Dillon Brooks, I mean, he did his thing. We talked about that earlier. He got his money, right? But for the Rockets, they overspent big time, in my opinion. As I know you wanted to bring in veteran vocal leaders for your young core, but $80 million is too much for Dillon Brooks, at least in my opinion, right? As this team brought in Jeff Green for $6 million. And to me, Jeff Green is going to provide better advice at this point in their careers than Dillon Brooks could have ever gained from his couple years in the league. So he brought in a guy like Jeff Green to give more advice than a Dillon Brooks. And to me, I just don't think you need to spend $80 million on a vocal leader when you can bring in a guy like Jeff Green or bring in other veterans right around the league, and they can come in and give some advice to this younger core and show them how they should be acting on and off the court. But Dillon Brooks, I will say, I'm not naive, right? He is more talented than Jeff Green, but I would have preferred like a 2-year deal for Dillon Brooks, maybe like a 2 years, $60 million overspend for him, right? If you wanted to bring him in that bad, overspend for him, give him $30 million a year, give him $20 to $30 million a year for a 2-year deal, so you can still have money to pay your guys when it's up for contract, like Jalen Green in a couple years, like Sengun in a couple years, right? Keep the options open. That's exactly what they did with Fred VanVleet. And I wish they just did that with Dillon Brooks, at least, right? At least in my opinion, or maybe like a 4-year, $50 million, something not as extreme as $20 million a season. I don't mind the Fred VanVleet signing. I want to throw that out there, as I think he's going to be a great veteran for this team that can also produce on the court, at least at a high level, unlike Dillon Brooks. And I mean, shout out to Fred VanVleet, right? I think that was actually a good pickup for the Houston Rockets. Moving over to the Cleveland Cavaliers. And this is an overreaction, I'm going to say that. But as a Cavs fan, I would have liked to see a bigger splash this offseason. As, sure, we re-signed Karis LeVert on a very team-friendly deal, I might add, right? So that's a plus, right? We can move him if the situation doesn't work at any point. But we also brought in Georges Niang and overpaid for Max Strus. a guy in Max Strus that he's a three-point specialist, right? But his career moment is probably going 0 of 10 from the three-point line in the NBA Finals. I will say that Max Strus will help the overall flow of the offense, as even if he's 0 of 5 from 3, I think teams will still guard him and respect him from that outside area, right? But, on the flip side, it's like, when we had Isaac Okoro the last 2 years, even if he was 2 of 3 from 3 or 3 of 3 from 3, teams weren't respecting him, right? They're like, we'll live and die with Okoro beating us. Where I don't think they'll do that with Max Strus, because even when he was 0 of 10 from 3 in the finals, the Nuggets were still guarding him. So, I mean, there is a respect level, and he will, provide spacing for our stars. I just wish we could have gotten in like the Kyle Kuzma stakes or the Jeremy Grant sweepstakes somehow, some way. Make a splash, right? As we wouldn't have been able to afford Jeremy Grant on that contract. But, I mean, hey, if he came to a situation where he was going to more so win, I think, a guy like Kuzma or Kelly Oubre is still on the market. Or a Jeremy Grant. I mean, these are some of the guys that I would have liked to see get brought in. But, I mean, I guess spacing is better than no spacing, right? And the last thing is the Philadelphia 76ers as the domino effect after James Harden. And we talked about this earlier with the Mavs and the possible domino effect they avoided this offseason. But for Philly, I mean, they may not be as lucky as the Dallas Mavericks. As James Harden, he's most likely going to be traded in the coming days, maybe the coming weeks, right? And depending on what Philly gets back, I think Embiid is he might be more frustrated that he doesn't have a second star next to him, right? There's still the possibility that he gets a Damian Lillard next to him, right? Or another guy next to him. But I think James Harden being traded, and if they don't get a secondary star, Joel Embiid may grow frustrated, right? He may get upset. And if he doesn't have enough help this year, he might get to the point where he wants out of Philadelphia after next season. As, again, this is the most extreme scenario. This is me thinking worst possible case, but the domino effect is real, and I think that could very well play out, right? I think Embiid, there's multiple teams around the league that if he does want out, they have the packages to get him, like a New York, like other teams around the league where Joel Embiid, I mean, if he gets frustrated with the lack of help this year, I mean, there's other teams where he can end up, and it would help out both sides. I mean, I can only imagine if Joel Embiid gets traded, it's got to be at least 10 first-round picks, right? at least 8, and you also have some pick swaps in there. But that is going to do it for our free agency winners and losers. We're going to move over now to the criteria that I have set for these 6 weeks of rankings, right? As I'm going to go through the top 10 point guards, shooting guards, small forwards, etc., etc. And I had to have a set criteria for you guys at home, so you guys weren't confused on how I was going off of this, as well as what am I going to use to rank these players. But I'm going to start this by saying that all the positions are going to be based off of Basketball Reference. And so that's number one, right? Number one is that I went off of Basketball Reference. That's where I got my positions. It's off of their main position. Number two, I went off of the player's overall skill and arsenal, right? As of late, the last 2 to 3 years, how talented is this player, right? They have to be a certain level of talented to make a list like this, to not to insult your intelligence. Health and availability was one for me that we'll see a guy like Chris Paul doesn't make my top 10 point guard strictly because of how he hasn't really been available the last couple of years. recent team success and situation, right? So Damian Lillard, he's had some team success in the last couple years, but last year, not so much. But I can assure you Damian Lillard is still a top 10 point guard in this league, right? So I accounted for their situation, their team success, their health, their overall skill, their individual stats, their individual moments. I accounted for everything, right? As we're going to do this all of kind of as like the last 2 to 3 years, what we've seen as of late from these top 10 players. Now, I will say that even though I'm accounting for the last 2 to 3 years of all of these players, the biggest thing that I'm looking at is this past season, right? What have we seen as of late? Kind of like recency bias, right? So the biggest thing is what I've seen as of late, but I am accounting for all the other stuff you see on your screen for the last 2 to 3 years. With that being said, we can finally get into these honorable mentions. As you see them on your screen now, we have Darius Garland, Jalen Brunson, Chris Paul, Drew Holiday, and LaMelo Ball. We're going to start with Darius Garland. Maybe the most underrated point guard in the league, maybe right next to Jalen Brunson. But to me, as a Cavs fan, if someone had to be left off, I'm okay with leaving one of my guys off of this list. Trust me, I would have loved to be biased. I would have loved to include Darius Garland on this list. But I will say that playoff stretch from him, aside from one game, it did leave a bitter taste in my mouth on Darius Garland. But regardless, he's still a top 15 point guard in this league, and he's going to be here for years to come. Maybe Darius Garland's on this list next season. Jalen Brunson, he was maybe the hardest to leave off of this list, as he had an amazing year, and he embarrassed my Cavs in the first round of the playoffs. He eventually went to the second round and lost to the Eastern Conference champs. But at the end of the day, I just want to see another season of that caliber from Jalen Brunson. And this is another guy that should be on the list next season, right, if he continues at that level of play. Chris Paul, to me, when healthy, this is a guy that at times shows flashes as one of the best in the game, right? He's the most efficient point guard of all time as far as assist to turnover ratio. So, late in games, no matter how he's playing, you always have a chance to win due to how good he is with the ball, right, and how smart he is on the court. It's going to be interesting to see how he plays in Golden State this year. Gives them a different level, a different tempo of scoring, right? But I think just with his health and his age, he misses the list for me, right, is basically my point here. Drew Holiday is another guy that I wanted to include on this list, but, there was just a couple guys that edged him out at the end of the day, right? As, whether if it was Darius Garland or Jalen Brunson or my top 10 list, there was just a couple guys that edged him out, but this is a guy to me that's still the best perimeter defender in the game and maybe in that conversation for the most underrated point guard in the game. And finally, a guy like LaMelo Ball, you can also have Cade Cunningham here if I can talk, or a couple other guys, right? But LaMelo Ball, even at his age, he shows promise year in and year out. I just need to see more from LaMelo Ball, and hopefully he can be healthy enough to do so consistently, right, for the next couple years. But moving over to the top 10 list, as we're about 20 minutes in, right? But we're going to get into the top 10 list now, as my number 10 point guard will be Tyrese Halliburton. I guess I should start this before I get into the deep dive by saying that if you see a guy at number 9 instead of number 10 or number 8 instead of number 9, don't go and, cause a big fuss about it, as if they're one spot away, it's all interchangeable. But Tyrese Halliburton, to me, this is a guy that was an all-star guard last season that averaged 20 points, 10 assists, a steal and a half a game. He led the league in assists for the majority of the year last year. And in fact, I think he had a 3-game stretch where he had 40 assists and 0 turnovers. That is absolutely insane at the point guard position. This is a guy that's been on a different level since being traded away from Sacramento. And not to mention, before his injury last year, before the All-Star break, he had the Pacers as a top 3 seed in the East, a game and a half away from first in the Eastern Conference. This is a guy that is that good, and he has the potential to be even better going forward. I'm excited to see what he and this Pacers team can do going forward, especially if Tyrese can stay healthy for the long haul. He might lead the Pacers to a top 4 seed next year in the East. That's how confident I am in Tyrese Halliburton. Moving over to my number 9 spot, as we have a guy in Jamal Murray. In my eyes, Jamal Murray has been the most underrated point guard in the NBA. I have said that for this entirety of this podcast, for the entire 9 months. He's been one of the most underrated point guards in the NBA. I think that has come to an end, though, after this NBA Finals run. As after coming off of that devastating knee injury he had in the bubble, Many, I think, forgot how good Jamal Murray was and the skill set that he had on a basketball court. And to me, coming into this year, my biggest question for the Nuggets, and I'm sure the rest of the media as well, right, was what version of Jamal Murray are we going to get? How quickly can he get back to that bubble version that we saw, dropping 40 points a night, 50 points a night? But the good thing for me, as an NBA fan, and the good thing for the Nuggets especially, we didn't get the bubble version of Jamal Murray this year. We got a better version of Jamal Murray this year. As we saw in the playoffs, Jamal Murray, he has the ability to score with the best of them, making tough shot after tough shot. He's a part of the best pick and roll in the game with Nikola Jokic. And again, Nikola Jokic is great, right? I mean, he's won 2 of the last 3 MVPs. But the Nuggets aren't NBA champions this year without the Jamal Murray that we just saw, point blank period. And it's crazy to me that I'm talking about a guy this highly of this caliber, and he's not a top 5 point guard in the game, but that goes to show how talented this position is. As point guard, of course, we're starting with the most stacked position. I think it is the most stacked position, at least as far as you can go a lot of different directions with these players and your rankings. But Tyrese Halliburton, Jamal Murray, my number 10 and number 9. My number 8 is going to be De'Aaron Fox. And there's a lot you can say about De'Aaron Fox and the season that he just had, right? But let's start with the big things that he just accomplished. I mean, he led the Sacramento Kings to the playoffs, ending their 16-year playoff drought, which was the longest streak out of all the big 3 professional sports. And he not only led them to the playoffs, I mean, he led them to the number 3 seed, taking the defending champs at the time to 7 games. I mean, if De'Aaron Fox doesn't injure his hand, maybe we're talking about how they had a competitive series with the Lakers, or maybe how they beat the Lakers and got to the Western Conference Finals, right? A lot of the butterfly effect. A lot of things could have happened if he didn't injure his hand. But this is a guy that was the clutchest player in the NBA last season per all statistics, right? And, I mean, overall, when you look at his statistical stats, he had his best overall year in his career so far. I mean, you can say that De'Aaron Fox is on a high right now, to be completely honest, and for good reason, right? With the season that he just had, leading them to the playoffs, having his best career year, taking the defending champs to 7 games. I understand if you're running to the comments and De'Aaron Fox at number 8 is way too low with the year that he just had, but I just want to see another year of that caliber that he just had for me to push him into like the top 5 point guards in the NBA. I mean, again, a small part of this was taking what has the team success looked like and what does his production look like the last 2 or 3 years, right? So for me, he's number 8 on this list, and we're going to move over to number 7, right? Trae Young. And I'm going to start this by saying he is a walking 26 points, 10 assists year in and year out. He's one of the best shooters, scorers, playmakers that we have in the league. And that's coming from a guy I'm not a big Trae Young guy. I'm going to say that here on this podcast. But I respect what he is as a basketball player, right? But as far as team success and individual performance, he's just, to me, had a little bit more success in those categories than the guys below him in the last couple years. Maybe aside from Jamal Murray, right, as Jamal Murray won a championship. But Trae Young, overall, statistically wise, it's a lot harder being the lead guy compared to a number 2 option. He's one of the worst defenders in the league. We know this. And, I mean, he's quite literally all offense and no defense. He's kind of made like a 2K player, a 2K point guard, as there is no defense to his game and only offense. But Trae Young, I get it. If he's too high for you on this list because his efficiency last year was down across the board. He had a very bad year efficiency-wise. So I understand if this is too high for you and if he's lower in your rankings. But to me, a lot of that can be scrapped up to the fact that he got a new backcourt mate in DeJounte Murray. And no matter what you say, he's going to need some time to adjust to that, right? To adjust to a different play style and to adjust to playing off the ball, right? Next to a guy like DeJounte Murray. But again, Trae Young is a defensive liability. Yes. Is he one of the most likable players in the league? No, right? But no matter what you say, he's one of the best guards that we have in the game today. And I would just prefer either more two-way ability from these top 6 guys or just overall superstardom, as we'll see here in the top 6, top 5-ish. But regardless, I think Trae Young gets back into the top 5 category, right, or conversation more so than this year. With Quinn Snyder back for a full year, they can have some time to mesh. And unless Trae Young runs another coach out of the building, I think Trae Young should maybe be back as a top 5 point guard. Moving over to number 6, no doubt, the hardest player for me to rank on this list was the Beard, was James Harden, as this is a guy that, aside from 2 games in the playoffs, he had another year where it was a subpar performance in the playoffs, right? That's kind of been what James Harden is known for, right? I have a good series, then I fall off, right? Or if I have a couple good games, and then I disappear. That's just been what we've known from James Harden in his career, right? But this is a guy that still averaged 21 points, 11 assists a game, which led the NBA, right? He also averaged 6 rebounds, a steal and a half a game on good efficiency. I mean, you can't ask for much more from a number 2 option, right? And I think that gets overshadowed here with a guy like James Harden. But for James Harden, is he the version that we once knew in Houston? Obviously, no, right? But even at the rate that he's at, he still does most of everything on the court for your basketball team. And I think it helped the Sixers get to the number 3 seed, right? And they had a 7-4 record in the playoffs. Regardless of how it finished in the second round, they had almost double the wins that they had losses in the NBA playoffs. I mean, this is a guy in James Harden who, as we know, as I mentioned earlier, he recently requested a trade, and he's probably on his way out of Philly, right? So it'll be interesting to see him on his, I believe, 4th team in 5 years. But even at his age, I mean, he's still an elite point guard in this game. But unfortunately for Harden, I think this is the highest he'll ever be again, as he's only on the way down of this list. But I mean, still, James Harden, hardest player for me to rank. I can understand if you have him at 7, 8, 9, or 10, right? But to me, I just went with how good he's been as a number 2 option. And at the end of the day, he led them to the playoffs, and they were an above-average playoff team. And I mean, if Game 7 goes a little bit different, if Jason Tatum doesn't have 51 points, maybe the Sixers end up making the finals, right? Moving over to the top 5 point guards, to me, Ja Morant kicks off this list as he has already achieved many accolades in his young career. I mean, he was the 2020 Rookie of the Year. He was a 2-time All-Star. I think he was a 2-time starter as well. I could be wrong. I know he's at least started once. But this is a guy that's also led his team to the playoffs the last 3 years, right? If I'm not mistaken, I think he was a top 3 seed in 2 of those years, right? So, I mean, this is a guy that just averaged 26 points, 6 rebounds, 8 assists, led his team to the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. I mean, he looks like a superstar, for the next decade at the point guard position. But to me, you just have to worry about his off-the-court antics. Is he going to get in his own way too much over his career that he's not going to have the Hall of Fame career that we all think he can have, the potential that he can have? Is he going to be in his way too much? That's the only worry for me going for Ja Morant moving forward. But, I mean, talented player, talented career, and he's no doubt a top 5 point guard. I don't care what he's done off the court. My number 4 is going to be Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I mean, he's one of the best young emerging guards that we have in the game today. I mean, he was an All-NBA member last season. And I think he has all the talent in the world to do that on a year-in and year-out basis, right? I mean, last year the Thunder were projected to be in the lottery, right before the season. They were projected to be in the Wemby sweepstakes. But Shai went out there and he did quite literally everything for the Thunder last season. He was averaging 31 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists with a steal and a half a game while leading the Thunder to a play-in spot, win, and 1 win away from the NBA playoffs. Again, like I just said, this is a team that was in the Scoot Henderson, Brandon Miller, Victor Wembanyama sweepstakes before the season, right? And then they almost make the playoffs. I mean, this is a guy that, Shai, you can argue Ja Morant is better. You can argue Shai is better. To me, maybe it's the recency bias that I went with Shai over Ja, right? But as of right now, give me the young Canadian and Shai. As if I'm starting a team, I think I'd rather have Shai Gilgeous over a guy like Ja Morant, right? But moving over to the top 3 point guards, you see it. I'm foreshadowing it as I have the Miami Heat background for Damian Lillard. Hopefully he goes to Miami. That would set up a nice dynamic there, a nice big 3 there, as he's also really good friends with Bam Adebayo. But, regardless of where Dame goes, he's still a top 3 point guard for me in the NBA. And as crazy as it might sound, I mean, this is the guy that might be in the conversation for the greatest scoring point guard of all time, as he has everything in his game offensively, right? I mean, this is a guy that just averaged 32 points per game while shooting 40% from 3. I mean, he makes half-court threes look routine, just like Steph Curry, and he makes those 40, 50, 60 special performances. It looks easy when it's coming from Damian Lillard or a guy like Steph Curry, right? But this is a guy in Damian Lillard who carried the Blazers to 8 straight playoff performances in his career. And though that doesn't affect today's video, like pretty much at all, it just shows the player and the leader that Damian Lillard is to carry a team like those to the playoffs for 8 consecutive years. I will say that I am happy that he's finally getting a change of scenery, as we talked about earlier in the episode. And to me, I mean, he doesn't have to run from the grind anymore, right? I mean, he got his gratitude from the city, and everyone's ready for a new chapter, right? He's going to be ready to go off to another team and compete for some championships before he hangs it up. But to me, I mean, it's absolutely crazy that he isn't a lock for top 2 point guards, but that just shows how talented the league is, right? But Damian Lillard, my number 3 point guard in the NBA going into next year. As much as I didn't want to put this guy here, Luka Doncic, my number 2 guy, right? As to me, he's a top 3 favorite player of mine in the league today, next to Kyrie and LeBron, and he's really the only argument, right, to compete with the number 1 guy. But I couldn't go there quite yet, all right? I had to show my flowers to the guy at the number 1 spot, which I'm sure you guys can imagine who it is. But Luka Doncic, Luka Magic, whatever you want to call this 24-year-old phenom is up to you. But to me, I just call him great, right? I mean, this is a guy that's a 4-time All-Star, 3-time All-NBA member, a walking triple-double in his career. I mean, quite literally, right? I mean, this is a guy that almost averaged a 30-point triple-double last year. He averaged 32 points, 8 rebounds, 8 assists, and sure, they missed the playoffs last year. But I'd bet a lot of money that this team does not miss the playoffs for 2 consecutive seasons. Again, I mean, Luka is special, and I really wanted to give him the number 1 spot. But I think after next year, this time next year, he's going to have the number 1 spot locked up, and it's not really going to be a conversation anymore, right? But to me, the number 1 spot, there is a debate, but there's just one guy that's head and shoulders above the rest right now, and that is Stephen Curry. This is a guy that is up there as one of the greatest offensive players to ever touch the court, right? And that might sound crazy, but that's not only for how he impacted the game with his shooting and how he revolutionized the game strictly with just off of his play style, but he also, just the attention he brings off ball, it's like something we've never seen in the NBA here for a guy that's just consistently running, and he changes game plans just for basically running around the court, right? This is a guy that is in the conversation for maybe the best point guard of all time, which might be a hot take, but I think as of right now, I would say Steph Curry is the greatest point guard of all time. I mean, he changed the game, period, right? With his play style, with his shooting, he changed the game for, as we know it, right? I mean, that 2016 year, though it has no effect on this video, just as a Cavs fan, that 2016 year, it changed the landscape of the NBA for a long time, right? As we know the NBA today, it's because of guys like Steph Curry and Klay Thompson in those, in those first couple championship runs. I mean, this is a guy that he's the greatest shooter of all time, and even at 35 years old, he's still the biggest threat to opposing teams, right? I think he's the biggest headache to opposing coaches when it comes to making their game plans. It's truly amazing, that after all these years, no one has seemed to figure him out yet, right? To find one plan to stop Stephen Curry. I mean, at this point, there is not a plan, right? You just have to hope he misses his shots. I mean, that's kind of really the only plan for stopping Steph Curry. But moving over just to recap, this is my top 10 list on the screen right now. Again, if a player is 1 spot difference, don't go to the comments and get mad about it, right? But now if you think that Shai Gilgeous is the number 1 point guard, we can have a debate about that, right? Or Jamal Murray's the number 1 point guard. I would say a little bit of recency bias, but if these guys are 5 spots different in your rankings, let me know down in the comments, right? I mean, that's something that I'd like to indulge on, like talk to you guys about, right? But to me, as of right now, going into the next season, this is my top 10 point guards, as you see on your screen. Moving over to NBA free agency, as this is going to be the closing of the show here, as we're going to talk about free agency and then some summer league. But we know what's happened so far. If you haven't kept up with the news, it's entirely too much for me to run through in today's episode. But I just want to look at the top 5 free agents that are remaining and where they might end up here, to close off this free agency pool, right? But P.J. Washington is a 6'7" forward for the Charlotte Hornets, formerly, right? And I think he's a decent floor spacer as well, to his credit. He's a versatile defender, and I think as of right now, he'll most likely end up back in Charlotte. But I don't know. There's a couple options. I can see a Washington, picking up P.J. Washington, which is what I predicted in the offseason. But, I mean, it'll be interesting to see where a guy like P.J. goes, as he does have his off-the-court issues, right? And I think he's more known for his off-the-court stuff than on the court. But P.J. Washington could still be a valuable piece to a rebuilding team, and maybe if he goes to a team like Washington, he can spread his wings a little bit as far as what we've known him to be as a player. Christian Wood, I mean, a very talented offensive big who is at times gifted, right? At least we see that potential. This is a big that shot 37% from three, right? With, I think, 4.5 attempts a game. So, I mean, this is a guy that's efficient. He can space the floor for you and do it at a very high level. I predicted Charlotte as a landing spot in the offseason, and I would still love to see that. I'd still love to see him go there with Brandon Miller and go there with LaMelo Ball. I think that pick and roll between LaMelo and Christian Wood, or that pick and pop, it'd be dangerous for a team like Charlotte to provide spacing also for a guy like Brandon Miller and LaMelo Ball and the other young pieces they have there in Charlotte. But moving over to Grant Williams, I mean, a gritty, strong defensive wing who can at times stretch the floor. He's streaky, right? But he's one of those dirty work guys that every contending team wants on their team. And even though he's only 24 and Joe Mazzulla he wasn't the biggest fan of him, I'll say that, last season, I can't see another place aside from Boston for a guy like Grant Williams, as he's also a restricted free agent. So I think he will be safely back in a Boston uniform next season. Maybe he gets traded, though, right? Maybe he gets traded. Kelly Oubre, I mean, no clue where this guy wants to go, as I've tried to look up all the reports. Maybe, someone knows something that we don't. Insider information. Who is he being in contact with? There is no information on Kelly Oubre. I have no clue where he's going to end up, because Charlotte just brought back Miles Bridges, right? And if they bring back a guy like P.J. Washington, is there going to be minutes for Kelly Oubre? I mean, maybe they can run LaMelo, Kelly Oubre, Brandon Miller, P.J. Washington, and Nick Richards. Maybe that could be their lineup going forward. But to me, I mean, it all depends on Charlotte, and I think that's the most likely scenario. I can see it fit with the Pacers. I could see it fit with the Cavs or Detroit. But I think he's probably going to go back to Charlotte, and they're going to have a lot of minutes they need to figure out there with all their forwards and wings that they have in Charlotte. Not Grant Williams, excuse me, but we're going to finish off here with Ayu Dosunmu, as he's a big guard. I mean, he's a big guard for the Chicago Bulls the last couple years, and he's a very good defender. I mean, he's gritty, and I can see a Chicago return, but if not, I'm very interested to see where he lands. There's not a lot of opening spots for point guards around the league, but maybe a team like the Pelicans, right? Or maybe another team like a return to the Chicago Bulls. Ayo has definitely shown a lot of promise there in Chicago, and I think he still has tons of untapped potential that he can tap into in a place like Chicago. But, those are the top 5 free agents. A lot of those guys are going to return to their teams, aside from Christian Wood. But a guy like Christian Wood, I really want to see him in Charlotte. I think that could work out for both sides. But moving over to Summer League to close off the show, as what's happened so far, right? As we know that the Salt Lake Summer League has officially started, right? This is kind of like the pre-Summer League, like the preseason, before they head over to Las Vegas for the actual Summer League, right? The ones that we always know and we can always watch on TV. But yesterday, the Salt Lake City Summer League started, and it started with the Miami Heat versus the Los Angeles Lakers, right? That it was featuring the number 18th overall pick in Jamie Jaquez Jr. Hopefully I pronounced that right. A guy that doesn't look like he can hoop, but again, looks can be deceiving. He put up 22 points, 3 rebounds, and 21 minutes of action. Very solid minutes from him, as again, looks can be deceiving, but he can really score, right? And Nikola Jovic, right? Not Jokic, but Jovic is a second-year man from Miami. He also had 21 points, 8 rebounds. So he had a pretty good showing there in Miami for their second Summer League game, or their first Summer League game, excuse me. But Miami came away with the win pretty handily. Memphis and the 76ers. I mean, Kenny Lofton, he continues to dominate at this G League level, as he put up 21 points, 13 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals. Also, David Roddy, a guy who I had no clue who he was, but he also pitched in 18 points for the Memphis Grizzlies, so shout out to him, as he might end up with a roster spot here if he continues to play at this level. Charlotte and the Spurs were the third game on tap, and it featured the number 2 overall pick in Brandon Miller, right? Sadly, no Victor Wembanyama, but we knew this, as Victor Wembanyama would not be playing until the Las Vegas Summer League, but rightfully so, right? But, Brandon Miller for the Hornets, he struggled, right, throughout this game. I think in the first half, he had 5 points and 6 fouls. You finished the game with 18 points and 6 turnovers with 7 fouls, right? I mean, at least he looked a lot better offensively in the second half, and he had a couple nice buckets, but you just want to see him, I guess, take the fouls down a little bit, right? But it also could be nerves, as that's his really first NBA action. But also, Julian Champagne, I think is how you say his name. Correct me in the comments if I'm saying that wrong. But he put up 30 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 steals for the San Antonio Spurs. I mean, he had an absolutely crazy game. And, I mean, Spurs came away with the win, right? The Oklahoma City Thunder were facing the Utah Jazz, and Jalen Williams, I mean, second-year man for the Thunder, he showed why he had no business playing at that level in the Summer League, as he led the Thunder to a win. He looked like the game was way too easy, and he put up about 21 points, right? So, OKC came away with the win pretty easily, and Chet also looked okay, right? I'll say that. He looked okay coming off of his knee injury. And then the last game of the night was Sacramento versus Golden State. I didn't watch this game live, I'll say that. I had to go back and watch the condensed version. But Keegan Murray, I mean, he for some reason was playing in Summer League, right? I thought I clicked on the wrong video. I thought I clicked on a video from last year, right? But Keegan Murray put up 29 points. He had 2 steals. He looked dominant, clear above and shoulder, head and shoulders above everybody else as far as talent. And he showed why he was the best player on the court, right? Putting up almost 30 points into a win for Sacramento. But that's going to do it for today's show, as we went through a lot today, right? We went through some free agency winners and losers. We went through the top 10 point guards. We looked at the 5 best remaining free agents and where they might end up. And then we closed off with some Summer League action. But that's going to do it. I mean, we covered a lot, and we're going to be back tomorrow with some undervalued fantasy football players that you can draft later in your drafts at a value to win your fantasy league. So if you're interested at all, support us down below. Drop a like, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 500 subs, and we're only like 120 away, right? So help us get to that mark, as that's like a milestone, right? That's one of the next big milestones for the channel, and we can't get there without you guys, right? So we appreciate any and all support. But until tomorrow, right, where we'll have some fantasy content, and Thursday, the next podcast, where we're going to do some NBA power rankings. Hopefully Damian Lillard is traded by then, so we have something to talk about. But until tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday, stay happy, stay healthy, have a good 4th of July, right? Don't get in too much trouble, don't do anything you're not supposed to. But have a good 4th, and we'll see you guys tomorrow, right? The grind doesn't stop. We'll see you guys then.